Hi folks, welcome to MMA Rewind. I'm your host Derek Pruitt. Now when I was thinking about today's video, I realized there would not be a more appropriate way to celebrate this weekend's UFC 300 than look back on where it all began, UFC 1. The event, later retconned to have the title The Beginning, took place on November 12, 1993 at the McNichols Arena in Denver, Colorado. The event was witnessed by 7,800 people in attendance and about 86,000 by pay-per-view. Now, the event was being pushed as a real-life version of the video game Mortal Kombat. No rules, style versus style. There were early on ideas to have the octagon surrounded by alligators or topped with razor wire. This was ultimately kiboshed because, aside from general sanity, the promoters did want there to be some air of legitimacy to the event. Although they wanted it to be a spectacle, they didn't want it to be seen as just a different kind of pro wrestling. The event starts off with a low-budget hype package in which all the participants are given either overblown or just plain made-up accolades to make them seem like a bigger deal than they were. Now, many high-level martial artists actually were invited to participate, but turned promoter SCG down because it was a small promotion with a relatively small prize amount and dangerous rules. The only fouls were eye-gouging, groin shots, and fighting, two of which will happen in this event, and neither of which will be punished. We then go to martial arts legend Bill Superfoot Wallace with what has to be the most unfortunate back-to-back sentences ever uttered on a sports broadcast. Now, the money they saved on fighters, they apparently spent on commentary, because they actually had a rather okay commentary team, with Wallace joined by NFL Hall of Famer Jim Brown and world champion kickboxer Kathy Long. I say only okay, because they still had no idea what was really going on. Speaking of the announce team, Wallace is an unintentional gem, mispronouncing just about everybody's name at some point during the broadcast.
Brian Kilmore be Gerard Jardot against Taylor Tooley, be Royce Gracie, Ron Goins.
After introducing the commentary team, they cut to a disguised promotion for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu.
Standing up, don't be surprised to see these people going to the ground, and I would say that the person that commands the fight is probably going to be the person who is skilled in grappling, and you're probably going to see jiu-jitsu, in my estimation, at its best.
They then throw to Brian Kilmeade standing in the octagon to describe the arena. And yes, that is a very young Fox News morning host, Brian Kilmeade, acting as in-cage interviewer. Now, before we get to the fights, I should warn anybody watching who isn't familiar with this particular era of mixed martial arts, this is a pretty brutal event, and not even the most brutal of its time period. Modern MMA has some violent fights, but this entire era was defined by people of vastly different size and skill levels being just thrown into the cage with predictably harsh outcomes. The first match is Dutch kickboxer Gerard Jardot versus retired sumo wrestler Taylor Tooley. After about 30 seconds, the bout is called to a stop after Jardot knocks one of Tooley's teeth out into the crowd while Tooley's sitting on the ground. Now, this kind of goes against the rules because they called it a TKO, but Tooley really wasn't out or anything, and the only way that it's supposed to end is KO, corner stoppage, or tap out. There's actually not allowed a referee to stop in and just stop a beating at this point in time. But like I said, they got around it with technically a TKO. Tooley's upset after the end of the bout, but it is telling that this was his only MMA bout. Afterwards, he went on to become an actor with several movie and television roles. Next fight is Kevin Rozier versus Zane Frazier. It starts with Rozier chasing Frazier around the ring before it devolves into a brawl. Rozier appears to be in control of the bout, but Frazier hits him with a low blow, one of the three things not allowed, but the referee doesn't appear to notice. After wrestling against the cage, they hit the ground briefly, with Frazier getting the better before Rozier forces his way up. Now, by this point, both fighters are completely gassed and just winging haymakers, and Rozier eventually just beats Frazier down and starts stomping his head in until TKO is called. There's not a whole bunch to say about this bout. It was a brawl with Rozier's size giving him the decisive advantage. Frazier went on to have a rather long mixed martial arts career, not retiring until 2008, but it wasn't the most successful, ending up with only 4 wins and 11 losses. Next up is Royce Gracie versus Art Jimmerson, and Royce comes out with the pay-per-view debut of the Gracie Train, an entrance that consists of a long line of Royce and various relatives and friends. The fight begins with Hoist throwing weak, stomping kicks that early jiu-jitsu guys were actually kind of known for in the early UFCs, while Jimerson, wearing one glove, danced around on the outside. Now, Jimerson's received a lot of flack over the years for wearing one glove into the octagon, but unlike most of the fighters, Jimerson was still in active competition, and the UFC was a bit of a sideshow for him. He had a possible boxing match coming up against Tommy the Hitman Hearns and wanted to make sure he didn't break his hand. Hoist eventually takes him down, and Jimerson struggles for a minute or so trying to get Hoist off before tapping out to, well, nothing, giving Hoist the victory and really pissing off the crowd.
You bet. It happens that quickly.
I don't think Art was hurt.
This is another thing that Jimerson gets a lot of crap for, but he was actually, from what I understand, working off of instructions from his corner. They told him to try to get up as fast as possible, and if he couldn't, to just tap out so he wouldn't get hurt. Although he did continue boxing, the fight with Tommy Hearns never did happen, and Jimerson's ultimate claim to fame would be this one bout in the first UFC and being the first person to ever actually tap out. After retiring from boxing, Jimerson would eventually become the head boxing coach at the UFC gym in Torrance, California. The next bout would be between two fixtures of early mixed martial arts, Ken Shamrock and Pat Smith. The fight starts and Shamrock immediately clinches Smith and gets him to the ground. Smith ties up Shamrock for a few minutes while Shamrock throwing a punch every few seconds until he falls back to a heel hook and after a moment or so cinches up the lock and Smith just taps out. There's a little scuffle in the ring because Smith loses his temper and the crowd is chanting their displeasure at what they think is a fixed fight.
Right now, could have been anyone. Yeah.
Now, early crowds could understand some grappling like chokeholds, but heel hooks were completely foreign to them, and so all they saw was Smith lying in the middle of the cage and just giving up. Now, Smith would go on to fight a couple more times in the UFC before leaving to fight in Japan, but his career would pretty much come to an end after an arrest and conviction in 1999 for sexual assault of a minor. Smith only had two more fights after that arrest, one in 2008 that he won by submission against tough man Eric Butterbean Esch, and one in 2015 that he lost by a KO in round 1. In 2019, Patrick Smith would die of bladder cancer. Next up is the first semi-final bout, Gerard Gordeau facing off with Kevin Rozier, the winner of our first two fights. Gordeau comes in with a broken right hand and an injured foot. What nobody realized until after the pay-per-view was that the thing that was causing the injury to his foot was that one of Tully's teeth was embedded in it. Now Gordeau starts off with leg kicks, chopping at Rozier, halting his movement before throwing a right straight that drops him. Rozier tries to fight his way back to his feet, but Gordeau keeps knocking him back down before ending the fight with a stomp to Rozier's ribs, causing a tap out. If it seems like all these fights are ending very quickly, it's because they are. The longest bout of the night was Rozier versus Frazier at 4 minutes and 20 seconds. That's almost twice as long as the second longest fight of the night, which is Hoist Gracie versus Art Jimerson, which only lasted 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Now, Rozier had a short MMA career, including appearing in the UFC one more time at UFC 4, before retiring from MMA with a 2-6 record. He continued in boxing and kickboxing before retiring in 2001. After a long period of ill health, Kevin Rozier died of a heart attack in 2015. The Gracie train shows up again as the next semifinal bout was Hoist Gracie versus Ken Shamrock. A lot of people were saying that they were upset that this wasn't the final bout, that it had been set up so that it'd be Shamrock and Gracie in the last fight. Now, Shamrock had actual shoot fighting and submission experience and was considerably larger than Gracie was. Hoist immediately shoots for a takedown, but Shamrock sprawls and rolls Gracie, trying to achieve mount. Hoist immediately spins out, returning to his feet before pulling guard. Kidney kicks and small punches from Gracie on the bottom before Shamrock tries to drop back for a leg lock, but accidentally pulls Hoist into mount. Shamrock tries to spin out, but Gracie uses his gi to lock in a choke, and the future UFC Hall of Famer taps out. There's some quick controversy because the referee misses the tap, but that's actually pretty quickly resolved. Now, if you're watching this, you probably already know who Ken Shamrock is. He goes on to have very long and illustrious careers in both mixed martial arts and professional wrestling. He's going to show up in lots of future videos. Now, one consequence of this bout is that it's the beginning of the first big-name rivalry in the UFC, and that helped both drive business and grow the company in its infancy. As a matter of fact, the rivalry between Gracie and Shamrock goes all the way till 2016. Next is more Gracie infomercial, as Horian, surrounded by all of his brothers, presents what's basically a Lifetime Achievement Award to his own father, Helio Gracie, who helped found the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu system, I guess you could call it. The crowd has some boos, but overall it's an okay moment. Now, I'm not sure when in the night this actually took place, because there appears to be an awkward cut in the footage, and Gordeau enters to an empty cage. So either this was pre-recorded at an earlier time, or the Gracies all left the cage to go stand in the back so that they could all enter in again. Either way, the final Gracie train of the night comes down to the cage as the championship bout between Royce Gracie and Gerard Gordeau is set to begin. Royce shoots, Gerard sprawls, and Gracie immediately springs up and goes for the outside trip, but unsuccessfully. They wrestle on the cage for about 30 seconds before Royce manages to spin Gordeau to the ground. Gracie quickly makes his way to the back and chokes Gordeau, but holding that choke a little extra long. Apparently, Royce held that choke because Gordeau bit him after they hit the ground. Now, Gordeau's dirty tactics wouldn't end there, as Gordeau had only one more mixed martial arts fight, competing at the Valley Tudo Japan 1995. There, he cemented himself as both a villain and just a horrible human being in general, by eye-gouging his opponent and blinding him in one eye. That event we'll cover in an upcoming video, so make sure to like and subscribe to stay notified. Royce gives a quick after-bout interview, and the broadcast ends with the family celebrating while Royce holds up a check for $50,000. Now, Royce would have a long but somewhat middling career as a mixed martial artist. He ended up with a pretty good record at 15-2-3, but that's padded with a lot of these early UFC bouts. Despite the lack of stiff competition, Royce is still, and rightfully in my opinion, considered a legend and pioneer of the sport. Overall, this event has to have an A. Yes, the fights weren't that technical, and the fighters weren't the best in the world, but they were the best that would agree to participate, and it was entertaining. Now, this event was supposed to be a one-off, but there was so much interest, and they made so much money, that it spawned multiple future events, and that would eventually become today's UFC, which this weekend is having their big, giant UFC 300 pay-per-view. Now, if there's any event that you guys specifically want me to cover, go ahead and comment below and let me know. I'll look through them, see which has a bunch of likes, and that'll get inserted as the 3rd or 4th episode, depending on when I decide to go and sit there and see which event everyone wants to see. Now, that's it for today's episode. Join us next week as we move to Japan, but not that far into the future, for Valley Tudo Japan 1994, in which we see the international debut of Royce's older brother, Rickson Gracie. Thank you all for watching, and have a good rest of your day.